Hello and welcome to the TID Water and Power Podcast. I'm your host, Constance Anderson, and on this month's episode, we're talking all things rates. TID works hard to provide some of the lowest electric and irrigation water rates in the region and the state, all while maintaining reliability. As such, TID customers have not experienced a rate increase for 10 years. However, with increased costs to provide reliable service and meeting various mandates imposed by the state, TID is considering a rate increase for the first time since 2015. On this episode, I'm joined by TID Chief Financial Officer and Assistant General Manager of Financial Services, Brian Stubbert, to discuss the key factors driving the proposed rate increase, the structure of TID rates, and the impacts of the proposed change. Brian, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me once again. Before we get started, I do want to say I absolutely love what you do. I think you do a fantastic job of interviewing, and I absolutely love the work that Brandon does behind the scenes to get everything. It's a top-notch podcast, and you do a phenomenal job.
Oh, well, thank you so much. We love hearing that, and we love that you are a regular listener of the podcast. So thank you so much for that. And yes, I second the comment that Brandon is an absolute wizard in producing the podcast month after month, and we are very fortunate to have him. So thank you for recognizing that. All right, so to get us started, Brian, we last had you on the podcast about a year ago to talk about the district's budgeting process, which, by the way, would be a great episode for our listeners of this podcast to check out for additional background about today's conversation. But for those who haven't yet listened to episode 31, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to the district?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I've been an accountant for 29 years. I started out in public accounting, conducting audits of, various companies, throughout the Central Valley. And then after that, I moved into the private industry where I worked in food processing for, about 11 years as an accountant there at various different levels. And then, back in 2011, I left the private industry, food processing, and I went to work for Merced Irrigation District, which is another local utility here within the valley.
Sure.
And so then I came over to TID as the Chief Financial Officer in December of 2017, and I've been here ever since. So this December will be 7 years.
Fantastic. Very good. Well, we're glad to have you here at TID and excited to have you on the podcast with us today. So just for context, what departments fall under the team that you lead, which we call the Financial Services Administration? Yeah,
there's 5 departments or 5 areas that, kind of report up through my administration. And, one of those is customer service. So if you have any questions on bills, whether that's electric or water, you would be reaching out to them. They work on the billing to make sure all the bills are accurate. Credit collections, customer service handles all things in that area. The water call center, if you're on the irrigation side, all of that is handled through customer service. IT or information technology, so everything that is related to, making things work here, electronically, throughout the district, from a computer perspective, that is in the IT area. Materials management, which is anything that has to do related with purchases, whether that's, purchasing things for stock items out in the warehouse that, maybe the line department or construction uses. All the way to if you're going to have a request for proposal or any of the bigger projects that we have going on, big construction projects, that's all handled there. And then also within that is the warehouse department. And so what holds all of the parts and all of the equipment and stuff that comes in, that is all handled out there in the warehouse as well. We have the accounting department, and so that handles all of the transactions that happen here from a receivable perspective. We pay all the bills, we payroll, keeping the books, doing the year-end audit, and then many other tasks are handled in the accounting area. And then we have the rates and risk area as kind of the final area within my administration. And so I think that one is really, pertinent now because we're going to be talking about rates here for this podcast. And so, we work on just kind of looking at where our rates in comparison to what our costs are, and do we need to do anything formal about this, or do we just need to keep an eye on it?
Very good. Okay, so we're going to dive a little bit deeper into what goes into the methodology and the process behind which we develop our rates a little bit later. But I think we should start with kind of the most newsworthy topic, the proposed rate change. So can you talk to us kind of at a high level about the proposed rate change? What does that look like? What are we considering?
Sure. First off, the district is considering rate changes to both the electric and irrigation customers. And, we've seen other utilities that have been increasing rates the last couple of years, up and down the state, some in the local area as well. But we've been able to hold off on rate increases by, just managing our reserves, optimizing, our assets that we have, here, whether it's the, natural gas-fired plants, the, Don Pedro, the hydro generation, using, our purchases timely, through our transmission lines, through the system to get power in. All of that is being optimized. And so, we have been able to hold off rate increases by managing those things. And then also by just looking at our expenditures, whether that's capital and O&M. We also did a cost of service analysis in order to, it showed that we have a revenue need. And so, that need needs to be recouped via rates. And so that's one of the areas that we looked at. TID, and we have maintained some of the lowest electric rates in the region and the state. And even with the proposed increases, we're still going to remain some of the lowest rates in the region. And we do have some public hearings that are set in order to discuss this further, and that's going to be for the electric side of the house. Electric rates are going to be discussed on November 26th. And then for the water rates, that's going to be discussed through a hearing on January 14th. So again, the two public hearings are November 26th for electric rates and January 14th for water rates.
Okay, very good. And Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe at those hearings, not only will they be discussing the proposed changes, but the board will actually be considering adoption of the rates at each of those meetings. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's going to be, a joint thing where you're going to have the hearing as well as the adoption on the same day. So November 26th for electric, January 14th for rates. For water, that's going to be the hearing as well as adoption of the rates.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, so let's get into some of the specifics with regard to the electric rates. What are the actual proposed changes?
Well, first off, I think the increase or, the impacts is going to depend on what rate type that you're talking about. Each customer within that rate type is going to feel things differently.
That's right. And I think we have, 27 different rate types? Is that right?
There's quite a few. Okay. Yes, absolutely. Okay. So, but yeah, everyone's going to feel it differently because everyone uses power differently. Sure. And so, you might be in a rate class that, might have a certain, increase, but you're going to feel that differently within that rate class. But residential is going to feel it differently than commercial. Commercial is going to feel it differently than industrial. Everyone's going to feel it differently, but then you as an individual or you as an individual company is going to feel it individually within that as well. Based on your usage, sure. Absolutely. And so, one of the other things that we're looking at when we look at whether or not a rate increase and how that's going to work and the impact it's going to have is we have different metrics that we use here at the district that we are, really focused on to make sure that we maintain the financial health of the district. Mm-hmm. And the two that we really look at is your days cash on hand as well as your debt service coverage calculation. And your days cash on hand, that is established by the cash reserve policy that we have established. The district has a formal reserve policy, and that policy establishes the targeted range in which we want to keep our cash. And so at the lower level on that targeted range is 225 days cash on hand, and on the upper end of that, it's 275 days cash on hand. And within that, within the policy, it establishes what we are to do if that goes above 275 days cash on hand. That's when we, will utilize some of the cash that's in reserves in order to cash fund capital or, maybe to pay off, debt. But those things are all established by the board on how they want us to utilize that cash. And over the last number of years, we've been cash funding capital in order to do that. There's also a provision for what happens if your cash levels drop below 225 days cash on hand. If it drops below that 225 days cash on hand, there's a 3-year period in which you can get the cash back up into that targeted range. And the reason why I put that 3 years in there was because we didn't want to have this really large increase in 1 year in order to get within that band. We wanted to make sure that was able to be smoothed in and to gradually get back into that level. Now, I will say one of the things that is in the policy is that it is a look back. And so it looks at what the audited numbers are, and it looks back to say, what are those days cash on hand? Well, for these purposes, because we're budgeting and we're planning, we're looking forward. So it's not going to be, the official number of days cash on hand, but it gives us that direction of where we're going. And so we have to start planning for that, because if you wait until you hit it, you may be too late. And so we are looking forward to where we should be. And so in looking at this, we are noticing that we are going to be dropping below that potentially by the end of this year. There's a good chance of that. But if we don't have any rate increases, there's a very strong likelihood we're going to hit that at the end of 2025.
Okay. All right. Very good.
And then the second metric that we look at is debt service coverage. And so looking at the debt service coverage is we budget to 1.5 times the cash available. And what that means is when you take your revenues, you subtract out all of your expenses until you get your operating expenses. Right before you get to your what you're paying for debt service, there's a cash balance there. And that balance needs to be 1.5 times what you're paying in debt service in that coming up year. This coming up year for TID's debt service, this doesn't include WEC, doesn't include Tuolumne Wind, which I should say Walnut Energy Center, and it doesn't include Tuolumne Wind Project. But the debt just for TID itself is $34.5 million, which means that total cash available needs to be 1.5 times that $34.5 million. And those are the two metrics that we use to determine, are we doing good as a district where we can maintain rates as they are, or do we need to look at, something else which would include, rate increases?
Okay. So you're factoring in these two metrics that you mentioned, and then from there you're going to determine what the revenue need is to make sure that we're where we should be on these two metrics. Can you tell us more about that, how that's calculated?
Sure. Well, what we do is we look at the revenue that's needed to cover those costs. And in that, it also factors in load growth. And so, you want to take into account any load change. Most times you have load growth where it's going up, but there are occasions in which you might have certain classes where you're expecting load to go down a little bit. And so you have to factor all of that into that need as far as, to make sure you set your rates at the appropriate level, because you want to factor in that growth so that you're not having too high or too low of a rate increase when you are applying that when the time for the cost of service.
Okay. So now the board is currently considering a 15.3% increase over the next 3 years. How will that be applied as far as meeting that 15.3%?
Yes, the board is considering a 15.3% increase over the next 3 years. And so what we're looking at is smoothing that in, because we are looking 3 years out to what we call a test year, which is in 2027. And that's a forecasted number for 2027. And so we're trying to smooth that in, similar to what we had for the cash reserve policy, where we don't want to have it all at one time. We want to be able to smooth that amount in. We are gradually getting there from a rate increase perspective. And so that 15.3 isn't going to happen all at one time. That's going to be just kind of smoothed in or gradually brought in over the next 3 years. And that's really, it kind of helps limit and spread out that impact to customers.
Okay.
Now, one thing I do think I need to add in here, and I is the effective rate. So you might hear that when we're talking about, general rates, and what does it cost to serve power, and really all that is if you look at the cost of service study, or you listen to some of the workshops, all that effective rate is it's taking that revenue that's needed and it's dividing it by the projected kilowatt hours, and it's saying what is that that dollar amount and that percentage that's needed there.
Okay. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about some of those specifics the further we get into this. But so you mentioned that the overall increase that's been determined that is needed and that has been proposed to the board will be spread out over the next 3 years. What specific increases are we looking at in each of those years?
Well, so let's use, your residential customers as an example. Now, This one is slightly more than what that average increase is. It's, not a lot more, but it is slightly different. And so this would mean a increase of 5.6% for, effective January 1st of 2025. And then it'd be another 5.6% in 2026, and then 5.5% in 2027. And so, that is, kind of smoothing that in so it's not that 15, 16% all at one time. It's kind of gradually bringing that in. Now, the actual impact to customers is really going to depend on how much power they use in a given month. You're not going to get that 5.6%. You might have less, you might have more, and that's all going to be dependent on how you use power for you as an individual. That was just an example for the residential customers. But for every rate class, you're going to, it's going to be different. Overall, it's at 15.3. And as, Constance, you mentioned earlier, there's 27 different rate classes. And, those proposed increases, they do have different impacts on those different classes. And then in addition to the rate increase, there's some small changes to the fee structure of the rates that we'll talk about a little bit later. Okay,
very good. So let's hold on the structure of the rates for now. But I want to go back to kind of that typical residential customer that you mentioned a minute ago. What will the increase at those percentages that you gave us, what does that look like for an average customer? And what do we consider an average customer?
Sure. So, the average residential usage, which we define as 905 kilowatt hours per month. Well, if you have that 905 kilowatt hour usage, you're going to see a monthly bill that's going to have an increase of approximately $8, per month from 2024 to 2025.
And that's under that initial 5.6% increase that will take effect on January 1, 2025.
That's correct.
Okay, very good. Okay, so talk a little bit more, but there's a lot to cover when we start talking about rates. We can go in a number of different directions with this, and we're going to hit them all. But let's bounce over to the irrigation side real quick. What are some of the proposed changes there?
Yeah, so for the irrigation side of the house, there's an increase of 6.1% overall for 3 years. It's roughly 2% per year is what we are looking at on the irrigation side. The rate structure is proposed to change for the irrigation rates. The fixed charge will remain the same at $60 per acre in a normal year and $68 per acre for a dry year. And so for a normal year, it's anything at 36 inches or above. And a dry year is less than 36 inches, and that's how that's established.
And that's
there.
Inches is water available to each of our growers.
That is correct.
Okay, very good.
The per acre foot charge, that's the volumetric side of the irrigation rate, that's going to increase to $2.70 per acre foot in 2025, $3.23 per acre foot in 2026, and $3.83 in 2027. And that's for the first three tiers. So that's combining tiers 1 through 3 into one rate. While the fourth tier is going to be $20 in each of the next 3 years. So that is not going to change. That will still stay at $20 if you hit that fourth tier.
And so, as you mentioned before, on the electric side, these per acre foot charges, again, is based on usage. So that's going to fluctuate from customer to customer depending on how many acre feet each grower uses.
Absolutely. Again, just like on the electric side, every customer is going to feel this differently.
Okay, very good. Any other changes on the irrigation side?
Yes, we are adding a minimum bill, which is that minimum bill is $200. That's going to be something that's new. And the garden head rotations, which have, typically incurred a fixed charge for water, that's going to follow the same rate scale as regular irrigators. So it'd be just in with the regular irrigation customers.
So again, based more volumetrically than just a flat fee.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. And so those with smaller parcels that receive water directly from canal turnouts, those will also have that minimum charge as well. But both account for the actual costs of providing water. And that's key to a cost of service study, is making sure that it accounts for the actual cost of providing that water.
Okay. And what, on the irrigation side, what was kind of driving that rate structure change?
One of it is just rate simplification, justification, of the cost of that water delivery, within that available water for each irrigation season. And what the available water is, that's defined as what the board establishes as that water at the beginning of the irrigation season. So if it's a 48 inch, if they establish it at 48 inches, then that's the available water for that year. If it's at 42 inches, then that would be the available water for that given year. And so tiers 1 through 3 would be up to that level. So in a 48 inch year, up to 48 inches is the available water for that year. That's tiers 1 through 3. Tier 4 would be anything above that 48 inches.
Okay, very good. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of the history behind what TID rates have been and kind of how we've been able to maintain those rates. We've mentioned that the last time we raised rates was 10 years ago. What was the timing on that specifically?
So yeah, it has been a decade since we have raised rates for both the electric and the irrigation side of the house. So it was January 2015 for electric rates. So around this same time, we're having the same discussions regarding electric rates. And in April of 2015 was when we increased rates on the irrigation side. And so it follows very similar pattern to what we are seeing this year, where we are having the discussions in 24 for a 2025 effective date.
Okay. And obviously, in each of those 10 years that we didn't raise rates, we're still doing the same calculations. We're still reviewing the same numbers, making sure that we have those metrics that you mentioned earlier, that we're falling within the right ranges on those. But how has the district been able to keep rates stable for so long?
I really like what you said about, we have been looking at this over these 10 years. It's not like we just had our cost of service study, we put it on the shelf, and we just kind of left it there. We have periodically looked at this, each year as we're going through with different levels of, do we need to do something? Do we not need to do something? We have actually looked at and even started a formal cost of service study a couple of times, but we got to a point where we realized that wasn't needed. We had the reserves, it wasn't needed to do it at that given time. And so we did not go forward with it. And so now we get to a point where, yes, we do believe that this is time for us to go forward with a rate increase, but that was a very good point where, we have been looking at this each and every year as over these last 10 years. It wasn't just put on a shelf and just, sat there and we didn't look at it at all.
Right.
So now talking about what have we been able to do to keep rates stable for so long? One of the things is the optimization of district assets. We have, as I mentioned previously, there's a lot of generation assets that we as a district have. There's a solar farm that we have a power purchase agreement with down south. There is a wind project that we own up in the state of Washington. There is natural gas-fired power plants that we have, a number of them here within our balancing authority. There's also Don Pedro, which is hydro generation. So we have wind, we have hydro, we have natural gas, we have solar. All of this is within our portfolio, and that we also have transmission rights that we are able to then go and purchase power off of, the grid. And so we look for ways that we can optimize that.
And that's kind of unique for TID, right? Not all of our sister utilities own that generation in-house. So that gives TID a little bit more flexibility than other utilities might not have.
That's absolutely correct. We do have, those assets that a lot of others don't have. That really came in to help in 2023 when we had that really wet, winter. And so that was able to give us a lot of hydro generation, which offset some of the other costs that we had. So we enable to use these assets that we have to our advantage. Not everybody within the state has that as an ability.
Mm-hmm. And what were some of the other ways in which TID was able to maintain rates for so long?
Well, a great example of that would be when we entered into the energy imbalance market, which was back in 2020. It's referred to it as EIM here within the district, but it's the energy imbalance market. So with the energy imbalance market, we were able to utilize this, and just this year, if you go back and you listen to I believe it was in October 22nd. I think Tricia, when she gave her update regarding the energy side of the house, she gave her update before the board. She said that so far, just through September, we as a district has been able to save $4.2 million in additional costs by utilizing this energy imbalance market.
Okay, so again, that's another, the energy imbalance market. We use that as a market to buy and sell energy. And so it gives TID that opportunity to kind of capitalize on lower cost, to purchase energy at a lower cost, and then additionally to sell extra generation that we might have on hand back to the market for others to purchase.
Yeah, that's the other side of the equation, right? Is being able to utilize the assets that we have to sell out on the open market. It's what we call wholesale sales, and so those wholesale sales go to help offset some of the costs that we have here. And so, when there's the greater the sales that we have, the less our costs are, the more benefit it's going to be for our customers.
Okay, very good. So we've got optimization of our generation assets. We've got using the opportunity that the EIM provides as far as a market for purchasing and selling energy. What else?
Well, we also utilize our reserves. That is something that we've really utilized over the last 5 years. Is, as I mentioned, there's that upper threshold of the reserve policy up above 275 days. And there's a time where we're close to 350 days cash on hand. And so utilizing those reserves in order to cash fund capital and thereby not adding additional debt into the system. And so by doing that, we've really been able to bring down what our debt levels are. And so that's a way in which, we have been able to help out the ratepayers, as well as our hedging strategies that we have regarding power purchases, making sure that we are being very systematic as far as going out there and making sure that we have a certain percentage of our upcoming needs that has already been hedged. And so that way, when you do have a big swing, like we saw back when the gas, and natural gas spiked and power prices spiked back at the end of 2022 and the beginning of 2023,
sure,
we had a lot of that power already hedged. And so we didn't see that impact as severely as others who didn't have a hedging policy would have. Now, so that those are some ways in which we can utilize that. Now, there's two sides to that, right? So now as we're, prices are coming down, we're seeing that, we're coming down at a slower rate than they are, but that's because we're being very systematic, very diligent, very disciplined in our hedging process. And over time, that really helps our customers by giving us more rate certainty, if you will.
Okay, very good.
And then I would say probably the last thing would be just other funding mechanisms. We've really utilized a lot of grants lately for different capital projects. I think Project Nexus, even though it wasn't a grant, that was actually in the state budget. So that helped pay for a project that will benefit our ratepayers, but it wasn't ratepayer dollars that was being utilized. We have other grants out there for other projects that we are utilizing in order to help offset those costs. And so therefore saving ratepayers in the long run by getting these projects done, but it's only being partially funded with ratepayer dollars. Some of it is being paid for with grants.
Okay, very good. And again, if folks want to learn more about the TID budgeting process across the board and sort of what some of these other funding mechanisms are that are used to maximize the dollars that our ratepayers pay, you can go back to episode 31 of the podcast and check that out. So, okay, through all of these different means, obviously TID has done a good job of capitalizing on these to delay any sort of rate increase for the last 10 years. Why is now the time for this increase?
Well, just like with every utility, actually every company that's out there now with, the cost of inflation over the last few years, especially since 2022, we're facing tough budgeting decisions. We are really trying to optimize the resources that we have and be able to set us in a position to do well going forward from an operations perspective. But we also need to make sure that we work to keep rates affordable. Mm-hmm. And so that is one of the key components here. One of the main driving principles that we have as a district is the affordability of our rates. And then looking at it, we started looking at our current rates will not support the rising cost to provide viable electricity. Or to upgrade the facilities that are needed, and also to address California's really ambitious mandates. And then we do have an increase in capital over the next few years that we're seeing an increase in that. So over this 3 years that we're talking about in this test period, we're looking at capital that's averaging over $105, $106 million a year.
Wow. Okay. So I want to dive a little bit deeper into that and kind of those three areas that you mentioned that are really impacting kind of this need for the rate increase. Can you tell us a little bit more about those?
Yeah, there's three main areas. One is reliability, right? How reliable is our system? When you go to turn on your electricity, is it going to be there? The other one is infrastructure. Do we have to replace aging infrastructure? Do we need to add new infrastructure because, we're growing as a community? And then I think last is state mandates. Just like with every industry here in California, there's a lot of state mandates that we have to follow, and they're becoming increasingly stringent and costly in order to be able to maintain.
Okay. What are some of the key projects? You mentioned infrastructure and some of these either facility upgrades or new facilities that are needed. What are some of those key projects that are driving the rate update?
Sure. I'll just give you a couple of them.
Okay.
The FERC relicensing that has been going on for a number of years, that's just to get our new license to operate Don Pedro. That's a must here at TID. But there's a cost associated with that. There's going to be mitigations that need to happen. A good example of that is river restoration. We're just completed a project on river restoration that is in the Tuolumne River. Those are things that are part of this mandate that we need to do. And so that can be very costly at times. We have $5 million a year budgeted just for not just river restoration, but other of these mitigation projects for the next 3 years. Another project is Don Pedro Life Extension. The facility up there, the powerhouse, is 50 years old. And so upgrading that and, replacing that, adding, it's a 50-year life, but we're adding 30% more capacity up there at Don Pedro. All of that goes into it. We also have the PPAs, which are power purchase agreements for our renewables. We talked a little bit, I mentioned earlier, regarding the solar farm that is, that we have as a power purchase agreement. There's more of those that we need to have, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, anything that's on the renewable side, we need to start looking for that because of these state mandates that we had mentioned before.
The state of California has said this much of your portfolio has to be renewable power by X date. And if we can't generate that from our internal generation assets, like the solar farm, then we have to purchase that elsewhere, and that comes at a cost. Absolutely.
Very well said. So, and I'd say one of the other big things, we're talking about infrastructure, is substation upgrades as well as new substations. That's a big thing right now, is just with the electrification that is being required throughout the state, is making sure that we have enough substations in order to be able to serve our existing customers as well as new customers that are coming in. The problem is substations are expensive, and the transformers and all of the other equipment necessary takes a while to get here. So you have to be planning a number of years in advance.
Sure.
All of these are some of the big capital projects that we have coming up.
And we do anticipate, as you mentioned earlier, that continued load growth, and not necessarily just at a slow rate of change, but we're looking at some pretty substantial load need in the next few years. And so that also then drives the need for these new substations to be able to have the capacity to serve. Okay, so as you've mentioned, every year TID takes a look at the cost of providing service against the revenue that we're receiving. But this year it was determined that a specific cost of service analysis was needed. How does that come about?
Well, as I mentioned, we're constantly looking at if rates, if the rates meet the costs that we have associated with it. Mm-hmm. And so if the costs actually exceed revenue, then we conduct a formal cost of service analysis, or a COSA as it's referred to. And so we did that. This is the first time as a district that we have utilized a third party in order to do this cost of service analysis.
Okay.
And so this cost of service analysis, this identifies where costs come from. It identifies the impacts and those costs by rate type. And so it separates it out into individual buckets. It starts by separating it between electric and water, and then from there it separates it further into different categories. And on the electric side, it would be, generation, transmission, distribution, customer charges. It looks at what are the, how does each customer use those types of, costs? Like, for instance, does, residential customers, how do they use the distribution costs? That's the wires to get it, from the substations to the house. How do they utilize that? Do they utilize that differently than a commercial or an industrial? How does a, industrial customer or a commercial customer, how do they use the transmission costs? That's to get either the power here or to get it from the generation to the substation. How do they utilize that? Is that different than a residential customer or another class, ag or farm or something along those lines? And so we have those costs that are identified. We separate those out. We look at how each customer class utilizes those costs, and then it assigns them into its individual, kind of cost type by rate class.
Okay. Very good. So is there anything new in the cost of service analysis that was performed this year versus previous times that we've completed the analysis?
I would say one of the things that would be considered new would be what's called water for fuel. And what this does is it identifies the value that is provided to the electric customers for running water through the Don Pedro powerhouse. Now, this value is a cost to the electric side of TID, and it represents the true cost to the electric side. Now, we need to value that true cost. And so that total value of the water that runs through the powerhouse, it has a market value. So the water system could sell that power, on the open market. It could go out there and sell that. And so this water for fuel calculation represents the market value of the power, and it subtracts out all the costs that the electric side of TID has already paid. And so this resulting difference is the cost that is transferred from the water side of TID to the electric side of TID. I would say that formal concept of water for fuel is different. There's been kind of some informal ones that are similar, but this is kind of that formalized what that value is and actually attributing that cost and transferring it. That I would say is new this year.
Okay, very good. So TID we know is an irrigation district first, where we have a water first priority, but we are able to capitalize on that water moving through the Don Pedro powerhouse to also then create electricity. So that's kind of the synergy between the two. And now we're taking that a step further to identify that water for fuel concept.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's very fair. Yes.
Okay. Very good. All right. So it's no secret that we've seen a lot of costs go up over recent years, everything from groceries to gas. And we know that TID is not the only utility that's been impacted by rising costs and kind of having to sort that out. How have other utilities in the state handled rising costs, and what has transpired then with their rates?
Sure. Many utilities across the state within our region have increased rates in recent years. And then some of them have actually had to go back in and then raise rates again. And so that's been kind of a common theme, is the raising of utility rates throughout, the state. And so, we did have to make some difficult budgeting decisions in order to stave off increases as long as possible. As I mentioned before, we utilized reserves. We had our hedging program. All of those things have been able to help us to minimize the impacts to our customers. And so, we've minimized budget increases year over year, and that's in comparison to other utilities within the state. So if you look at some of the others, our increases have been, less than theirs. But still, it was a big increase for us over the years just because, cost of living went up. We had inflation that was so high, but we tried to minimize that as much as we possibly could.
Okay. So knowing then that other utilities have also likely had to increase rates in our area, how do TID's rates compare to others around the state?
Well, if you're going to compare us to, we consider an IOU or an investor-owned utility within the state, like, for instance, PG&E. Well, TID is significantly lower than the IOUs and PG&E specific.
And TID is a publicly owned utility, so a POU versus an IOU.
Absolutely, yeah. So in comparison to other publicly owned utilities, similar to TID, like you mentioned, a POU, we do have some of the lowest rates in the region and the state. If the proposed rate change is approved, TID would still have some of the lowest rates amongst those within the region.
Okay. And how does that play out over this 3-year rollout that we're considering?
So we did a multi-year comparison to others, and that comparison, shows that we do have lower rates in 2027 compared to others that were just utilizing their 2025 rates. So what we did is we looked at what our rates were in 2020, currently 2025, 2026, 2027, and we compared those with, a couple of publicly owned utilities within the region, as well as with PG&E, and we looked at where we compared with those. But since we didn't have the rates for 2027 for those areas, we had to use what was available. And so for some of those publicly owned utilities, they were their 2025 rates. Some of those were their 2024 rates, but we did those comparisons, and we saw that even with that, we were very comparable with those, and we're lower in most instances than their current 2024 or 2025 rates. There were a couple of instances where it was 2026 where we were comparable, but in 2027 we got a little bit higher, but still very comparable with their 2025 rates.
Okay. So even after we complete this 3-year rollout for the total 15.3% increase, we're still comparable, if not lower, than a lot of our counterparts in the state.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. And if people want to kind of check out these comparisons for themselves, is this information available anywhere?
Yeah, we do have it available on our website, www.tid.org/rate updates.
All right. Very good. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that I wanted to get into the rate structure a little bit more. How are TID electric rates structured? I know a lot of times when paying bills, and present company included, the customers look at that kind of bottom line total amount due and pay that, or know that they need to pay that. But there's a lot more detail on the bill as to how that bottom line number is actually generated. Can you help break that down for us?
Sure.
And I would just say for any of our listeners, if you have your TID bill handy, grab it so you can kind of follow along.
Absolutely. So, first I want to say that the structure is going to depend on your rate class.
Okay.
For instance, some rate classes just have a customer charge and they have an energy charge. And then they have a couple of other, charges that are very similar amongst that, which you're going to get to here in a minute. But again, so some are just going to have, the energy charge. You're just going to have the customer charge. Others will have a demand charge that is included in there. Those are more of your industrial customers and a few others. And then some have a connected load. Again, those are more of kind of your industrial, some of your commercial, municipal, those types of rates in there. So, but those, everything is going to look a little bit different. And so that variable portion, that energy charge, if you will, that is going to depend on, how much you use, as well as the winter rate and summer rate. There's a different charge there. And as you expect, we are what's called a summer peaking utility, meaning that we use the most electricity in the summertime. It makes sense. We're in the Central Valley. It gets to be well over 100 degrees. Everyone has their air conditions on.
Right.
Well, those costs can actually be higher during the summer that we as a utility have to incur. And so that's why you'll see a winter charge as well as a summer charge, those two different rates in there. And then, as I mentioned, there's a other schedule of charges in there. There's a customer charge. That's a fixed charge monthly. There is a power supply adjustment. And that can either be a credit or a charge. It can be up to a 0.5 cent credit or a 1 cent charge per kilowatt hour on the bill. There's an environmental charge, and we're going to talk a little bit more on that in a little bit. And then there's a public benefit charge that's on there, and that is state mandated. That percentage that you see on there, that is a state mandated percentage that we have to put on everyone's bill. There's a state of California surcharge. And then, as I mentioned before, some customers have a demand charge. Okay.
And you mentioned that there's some of those fees are variable, some of them are fixed. Can you kind of break that down for us a little bit more?
Yeah. So our rates are broken out into two different components. There's a variable portion, and then there's a fixed portion to what our costs are internally. And so this is to kind of, your fixed charge is the cost that it is for all the infrastructure to get the power to your house. And so that charge is needed regardless, right? That's the maintenance of the wires that bring it there. It's the transformer. It's the meter. It's everything that's associated with getting it from the generation facility to the substation all the way into where to your house. And so then you have the energy charge. And so that's more of the actual cost of the power itself. Was it expensive? Was it cheap? How does that factor in? Is it natural gas? Are we talking about more expensive renewables? How is that being factored into that? So those are the two basic components, a fixed and a variable component.
Okay, thanks for that. So with the proposed rate change, what exactly is changing and what is staying the same?
So yes, there are going to be some proposed changes to this rate structure. For instance, one of those is the environmental charge. That's going to be going away, and the revenue that we would have collected underneath the environmental charge is going to be spread through the other components of the energy bill. And so another thing we're going to be doing is shifting the percentage of rates from the volumetric to the fixed charges gradually each year.
Okay. And why is that?
Well, one of the things when we were doing the cost of service study is it, showed that 48% of TID's costs are fixed, but only 19% of the revenue that we need is being recovered through the fixed charge. And your fixed charge would be like your customer charge, your demand charge. Those are those are how we are collecting for those fixed costs. But as I mentioned, 48% of our costs are fixed, but 19% of the revenue recovery was through that fixed component of the bill. Okay. And so what we're trying to do over those 3 years is we're not trying to go from 19 to 48% right away. Okay. We're not even trying to go from 19 to 48% at the end of this, 3 years. So, we're trying to move over the 3 years to be closer to that fixed cost recovery. And so where we're going from 19% currently, at the end of 3 years, we're going to be 25% is going to be covered through those fixed charges. And we're gradually moving that in from 19 to 25 over these next 3 years.
Okay. So we're not looking to get to a point in the next 3 years where we're recovering that full 48%. We're just kind of incrementally bumping that up a little bit to close that gap slightly.
Absolutely. We're trying to avoid, rate shock to our customers.
Sure.
We're trying to just gradually move that direction instead of just all at once, because that could be, depending on your usage, that could be a very drastic increase for customers. And we know that some of these changes are going to be, it's going to impact people differently than others, and some, might feel a higher amount.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so now let's go back to the power supply adjustment or PSA fee that you mentioned, or I should say fee or credit. Remind us what that is and how the PSA will be updated under this current rate update.
The power supply adjustment, which if you look at your bill, it's currently at 1/2 cent credit. That is a mechanism by which we as a district are able to, that charge is adjusted based off of what the cost of power is. There's a lot that goes into that calculation, but really what it's doing is it's trying to adjust the amount that we either need to collect from customers or give back to customers based off of what the natural gas and the cost of power is. Again, it's more complex than this, but just at a very, very high level.
Sure.
And so that is something that is currently at 1/2 cent credit, but it is moving to zero when we adjust these rates. This is not a rate increase itself. It's a charge that is on the bill in order to collect those fluctuations in power costs up and down. And so that is something that is looked at twice a year. And so that's when you see that change. From 2015 through December of 2022, that was at a 1/2 cent credit. But as I mentioned previous in the podcast, there was a large spike in natural gas prices. The cost of power at December of 2022, things really shot up. And so from December of 22 through June of 24, it was at a 1/2 cent charge. Okay. Now in June of 24, it went back to a 1/2 cent credit. But then this credit will be reset to zero when we set rates again in January 1st. So that will be in addition to whatever percentage you have for your rate class. This 1/2 cent credit per kilowatt hour will be going away and be reset to zero. So that's in addition to the rate increase.
Okay. And tell me if I'm oversimplifying this, but when we do a cost analysis survey and we look at the larger need with regard to a rate increase, that kind of takes into consideration all of our expenses and all of our costs, whereas the PSA just looks at that fuel cost. And so whether like the spike that you mentioned, those happen occasionally, sometimes the price drops, it gives us the opportunity to kind of smooth that out through either a 1/2 cent credit or a full cent charge, anywhere in between there, to our customers.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I mean, like I said, that cost itself and what it's capturing is a little bit, can get, a little bit complicated, but yes, that's exactly what it's supposed to be doing.
And so why are we resetting that to zero as part of the current rate update?
As we adjust rates, it makes sense to move the PSA to 0 and to just reset that. And it's keeping it at what the base rates and allowing that movement as needed in the future.
Okay, makes sense. All right, so we've mentioned a number of times that the rate increase, if and when approved by the board, is going to affect all of our customers a little bit differently, depending on their rate type, depending on their usage. So how can our customers kind of see how these rate changes or these updates will affect their own bills?
Yeah, well, great question. We've developed a bill calculator to help customers estimate the potential impacts to their bills. And, as we mentioned, the impacts will depend on a customer's usage. So that, the calculator can actually help an individual customer estimate what those impacts are going to be.
Okay. And where can they find this calculator?
It's at TID.org/rate update.
Okay. So again, if you're listening to this and you've got your TID bill handy, you can actually take the usage from I would use one of your wintertime bills, because that's the rate schedule that we're going to be on currently in January. And then plug in your actual usage to kind of get a general estimate as to how the rate update will impact your bill. All right. Are there ways that customers can keep their electric bills down even during some of these proposed increases?
Sure. One thing that you can do is you can log into your MyTID account and you can track your energy usage and see when, are you using it more? Is there something that you can do in order to, reduce the amount of usage that you have as a business, as a household, and we also have energy efficiency tips on our website to help customers use less energy around the home. We also have energy efficiency rebates for customers looking to replace old appliances with new energy efficient models. So those are 3 ways in which you can kind of help with keep your electric bills down.
That's right. And we should mention that both the MyTID opportunity, which is, if you're logging on, my.tid.org, both the MyTID and the energy efficiency rebates, those are available to both residential and commercial customers. So everyone should kind of take a look at those and how they might save a little based on either their usage or the rebates available. Are there any additional programs that TID has available to help customers?
Yes. As I mentioned, every customer is going to feel this differently. There is a, increase for the residential customers, and we know that that's going to impact some of our low-income customers, And so what we have there is we're proposing changes to what's called our TID CARES program. And that's to better support our customers' needs. And so in 2025, those who qualify for the CARES program, because you do have to qualify for it, but those who qualify for the CARES program in 2025, they're going to receive a $16 discount on your customer charge and a 15% off of the first 800 kilowatt hours each month. In 2026, it's going to go from a $16 discount on the customer charge to a $20 discount and a 10% off on the first 800 kilowatt hours used each month. And then in 2027, it's going to go to $30 off on the customer charge and 0% on the first 800 kilowatt hour usage. I would like to point out that in 2027, the $30 for the discount is going to be the same as what we are proposing the customer charge go to. So 100% of the customer charge is going to be offset by this CARES discount if you qualify for that program.
So again, making that a fixed discount versus a more variable discount.
Yes, because we found that not all of our customers that qualify for CARES use up to 800 kilowatt hours in a given month. And so we want to make sure that those that qualify for this program are able to fully utilize the discount that is available to them. And so transitioning to this is just something that we felt would just help out all of our customers in that qualify for the CARES program.
Very good. Thanks.
Another program is the medical rate. That's designed for customers that regularly use a medical life support device or have a condition that requires special heating or cooling. And that reduces the rate of the first 500 kilowatt hours each month by 50%. And so that if you qualify for the medical discount, you would get 50% off of the first 500 kilowatt hours for that month. And then this next one isn't really how to, you're not going to save anything. There's no discount on this. But the third thing is budget billing. And so even though that doesn't give you a discount, what it can do is it can smooth out those dollars each month that you're paying, so you're not seeing that seasonality high that you normally get in the summer, but that kind of just flattens that out so you have an equal payment throughout with a true up at the end.
Okay, so that takes away some of those spikes in your bills and also makes it easier to plan for the year because that amount is more evened out, as you mentioned, throughout the year.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Okay, so this has been a lot. As we've said before, there's a lot that goes into the consideration of how TID sets its rates. There's a lot of information and calculation that is used to kind of get us to this point. Are there any other items of note that we want to make mention of here, just to kind of wrap things up?
If you want to learn more, about the rates and what's coming up with this, cost of service study and this rate, increased rate proposal, you can learn more at tid.org/rate updates. You can check your TID bills for more information. There is the workshop that we did on October 29th. That is available on the for the electric side, but if you're also interested on the water side, we had one on November 5th. Was when our workshop was for the water rates. And then also you could utilize the bill calculator as well. That's there at tid.org/rate updates. We do have a hearing date for the electric rates, November 26th of 2024 at 9 a.m. Here in the boardroom. And again, that's going to be the hearing as well as the adoption on November 26th. And then for the water rates, the hearing and the adoption is on January 14th, 2025 at 9 a.m. And as I mentioned, both are here at the Turlock office for that time period.
Okay, very good. Well, Brian, I can only imagine that you and your team, your heads must be spinning with all of this information and everything that has gone into determining what this rate increase needs to be while always keeping our customers in mind and keeping rate affordability in mind. So we thank you for all of the work that you guys have done behind the scenes and for the rollout of the proposed rate change in a way that we hope will be the least impactful to our customers. Again, knowing that a rate increase impacts everyone differently, but appreciate the care and consideration that you put into how it's rolled out. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the podcast today. Thank you for tuning in to the TID Water and Power Podcast. You can find TID on Facebook at facebook.com/TurlockID, on Instagram and Twitter at TurlockID, and on LinkedIn as the Turlock Irrigation District. I'm your host, Constance Anderson. We'll see you again next time.